From the title of this video, you know what this is going to be about. I'm just going to take a look at the Power A Gamecube controller versus a first-party GameCube controller. There's been a lot of reviews on this Power A controller, but a lot of them don't really go super in-depth with how the buttons actually feel compared to a first-party controller. Now, first off, this controller is obviously wireless, so it can connect directly to your Switch, which is the reason I got it, because I wanted to play Smash Bros. Easily on the go without having to have any extra cords or wires hanging around. The first thing you're going to notice about this controller is it looks almost identical to a first-party controller. However, it does feel a little tiny bit cheaper plastic-wise. It's a little more textured than this controller is, which, I mean, it doesn't really make that big of a difference to me. I do prefer the smoother controller, but that's mostly just personal preference. I'm just going to work my way from right to left on these controllers and just kind of compare them as we go. So first off, the X, Y, and A buttons on both controllers all feel pretty much exactly the same. However, there's a tiny bit of a difference between the X and Y buttons on each of these controllers. It's very, very slight. I do notice it a tiny bit, but it's really not a make or break deal. So on the first-party game controllers, the edges of these buttons are a little bit smoother, they're a little rounder, and the Y button isn't as slanted as the Power A controller. The edges of these buttons are just a little sharper. You can kind of see it on the Y button here, and this is just slightly more slanted. The biggest difference this makes is when your thumb is resting on the Y and the A button, it tilts the top of your thumb up just slightly more than it does with this controller here. It's such a minor little thing, but I do find that I prefer the first-party GameCube controller because I'm just so used to playing with my thumb pointed down slightly after just years and years of using GameCube controllers. Otherwise, all these buttons are pretty much exactly the same. Now, the C-stick has another bit of a difference. On the first-party controller, there's a bit of rubber on the tip so it'll grip your finger. And on the Power A controller, it's mostly just hard plastic, so as you can see, it slips out from under my finger there. Kind of a minor difference, but it just makes this feel a little cheaper. The next big difference, obviously, is the first-party controller only has a start button, and the third-party controller has a plus-minus screen capture and home button. So when you're playing with this controller, you can actually get back to the home menu. When you're playing with a first-party controller, you have to have an extra Joy-Con or Pro controller or something with a home button around you to be able to get back to the main menu of your Switch. Next is the D-pad. This D-pad is quite a bit smaller than the Power A one. That's a big complaint a lot of people have had with the D-pad on the first-party controllers. It's just too small, but they fixed that issue with the Power A controller. They made it a little bit bigger. It doesn't really matter for Smash Bros. At all, but that's just a nice little touch. And for the main control stick, it has the same issue as the C-stick. It just feels a little cheaper on the Power A controller. The first-party controller has deeper grooves and is rubber on top, whereas the Power A controller has shallow grooves and it's a little bit of a harder rubber. I think there's still rubber on there, it's just a little harder, so I find it doesn't grip my finger quite as well. But again, it's a minor little difference. Next is the obvious inclusion of an L button on the wireless controller. They are raised out quite a bit more than the traditional Z button, meaning you have to push them in a little bit farther to get them to activate. But personally for me, I never use the Z button for Smash Bros, so it doesn't really make a difference for me, and if I wanted to use this for any other game, I have both my L and R buttons. Now the biggest differences come from the actual L and R buttons. So on a GameCube controller, you have your L and R here, and as you can see right here, it dips all the way down past where that screw is, so it gives your finger room to kind of sit over top of the button. But on the Power A controller, they have that part bulge out a little more past where the screws are to compensate for the battery portion. So your finger actually hits that when you try and push the button. So I find I have to push more with the joint on my finger as opposed to just pushing with the tip of my finger. In both cases though, because Switch works mostly on digital buttons, this has been turned into a digital button instead of an analog button, so you don't have that kind of half press ability that you do with the GameCube controller. But it doesn't really do anything in any Switch games anyway, so it doesn't matter. You have to push them down pretty much the same amount to get all the way down to the button at the base. The second thing I've noticed, and this again is just kind of comfort and feel for the controller, is this part here bends up a little bit more, leaving you a tiny bit more room for your finger to kind of hook in there. And with this controller, because of the battery pack, this comes down a tiny bit more, so when you're holding it in your hand, your finger can't go quite as high up as before. It's by like a few millimeters but it actually makes quite a bit of a difference in feel. It just feels like there's something in the way, and again, that's just because I've had so many years of experience with this GameCube controller. This just fits in my hand slightly better than the Power A controller does. Other than that, both of these controllers are nearly identical. There's just the minor little changes with the buttons and the L and R triggers and everything like that. If you're switching from one to another, you're not going to notice too much of a difference, but there is a couple things to keep in mind there. Some minor little things that might change how it feels in your hand. One more thing to keep in mind with the wireless controller is the two sticks actually click in, so you have that option for other games. It doesn't do anything in Smash Bros, but it's just kind of a nice little feature. And obviously it's wireless, so that makes setting it up and connecting it to your Switch quite a bit easier. You don't need extra adapters. There's not 10 feet of cord kind of in your way as you're trying to play your game. Two more important things to note is, first off, you cannot switch any of these buttons out with first-party buttons. I found out the hard way. I went out and I got a screwdriver and I opened up my controller and I tried to switch the buttons. The internals of this controller are quite a bit different, so you are not able to swap out any of these sticks or anything with first-party control sticks or buttons. And the second thing is, I've been doing some research on input lag between wired GameCube controllers, wireless controllers. It seems as though the difference in input lag between a wired controller and a wireless controller is about a frame or half a frame. So this being wireless shouldn't make too much of a difference compared to your wired controller. I haven't noticed a difference between them at all. So far, it seems like the difference between these two is minuscule when it comes to input lag. Anyways, guys, thanks for watching. I just wanted to make this quick review because a lot of reviews out there don't go over how each button actually feels and how the controller feels in your hand, which is the most important part when you're playing a game. You want a controller that's comfortable, not a controller that's uncomfortable and hard to use. So if you need a wireless alternative to a GameCube controller, I would absolutely go with this Power A controller. And if you want to go one step further, check out the video I linked in my end roll. See you later.